In the summer of 1944, the Allies achieved what planners had dreamed of for years. The German front in France collapsed. But just as victory seemed inevitable, something far more fragile began to fail. Not weapons, not soldiers, supplies. The fastest advance of the entire campaign was threatening to stop. The problem wasn't at the front lines. It was behind them, where supplies couldn't move fast enough. Behind the front lines, a silent crisis was unfolding. Railways were destroyed, ports were useless, and the infrastructure meant to support victory simply didn't exist. Every kilometer gained made the problem worse. Tanks risked running dry. Armies risked standing still. So, how do you keep an invasion alive when the system designed to sustain it has collapsed? And what happens when speed becomes both the greatest advantage and the greatest danger? To understand how the Allied advance survived, we need to look beyond the battlefield and back to the moment logistics became the war. Before Allied troops ever set foot on the beaches of Normandy, logistics planners believed the war in Western Europe would be decided by ports, railroads, and carefully staged supply depots. Beginning in 1942, Operation Bolero moved enormous quantities of American troops and material into the United Kingdom, with the expectation that once France was invaded, supplies would flow inland through captured ports and restored rail lines. By early 1944, more than 1 million tons of supplies per month were stockpiled in Britain, creating confidence that sustainment had been solved before the fighting even began. On paper, the system seemed robust, orderly, and predictable. That plan began to unravel almost immediately after D-Day. Allied air forces had spent months bombing French railways and bridges to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. The strategy worked, but it produced an unintended consequence. The same shattered rail network the Allies needed was now unusable. Ports that were meant to anchor the logistics system were either still in German hands or deliberately destroyed before capture. Cherbourg, seized after weeks of fighting, was left so badly damaged that it could not handle expected cargo volumes. As a result, supplies continued to pour across the beaches, overwhelming temporary facilities. In July 1944, the battlefield situation changed dramatically. Operations Goodwood and Cobra shattered German defenses, and the failed German counterattack at Mortain led to the collapse of enemy forces around Falaise. Allied units surged forward at a speed no planner had predicted. What had been short, manageable supply lines suddenly stretched hundreds of kilometers. Depots lagged behind the front. Traffic control collapsed, and French roads, never designed for heavy military traffic, became choked with vehicles. The faster the armies advanced, the worse the logistical strain became. Consumption figures revealed the scale of the looming crisis. A single U.S. division required hundreds of tons of supplies per day. Fuel was the most critical commodity. Entire armored formations were at risk of stopping, not because of German resistance, but because gasoline could not reach them. Belate Auguste American armies were consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel daily, while ammunition and food requirements continued to rise. Commanders openly feared that the offensive might culminate prematurely, handing the enemy time to regroup. This was the paradox of Allied success in France. Victory created vulnerability. The infrastructure meant to support a methodical advance could not keep pace with a rapidly collapsing enemy. Railways were ruined, ports were unusable, and pipelines were non-existent. Without an immediate solution, the greatest breakthrough of the campaign risked grinding to a halt on empty roads. The crisis was no longer tactical or strategic. It was logistical, and it demanded an answer measured not in divisions, but in miles, tons, and trucks. They understood that, without adaptation, momentum would vanish, opportunity would fade, and the campaign itself could stall. Despite battlefield superiority and overwhelming strength, the Red Bull Express was born from desperation rather than doctrine. By late August 1944, American commanders recognized that railroads, ports, and pipelines could not support the pace of the advance. During an intense planning effort, lasting little more than 36 hours, logisticians concluded that only massive road transport could prevent collapse. Trucks would replace trains, speed would replace efficiency, and improvisation would replace doctrine. The concept was simple: create a supply system with absolute priority, stripping resources from everywhere else if necessary, and push them forward without interruption. In that moment, logistics became an emergency weapon, not a background function. The name Red Ball Express came from railroad slang, meaning express freight, a term already familiar to American logisticians. In France, the concept was transformed into a visual system. Red ball symbols were painted on signs, vehicles, and cargo, signaling that these loads had priority above all others. Anything marked with the red ball moved first, no matter the disruption caused elsewhere. This symbolism mattered because it created clarity amid chaos. Soldiers, drivers, and traffic controllers immediately understood what mattered most. The red ball was not just a route, it was a rule set imposed on an overstretched army. In practice, the system relied on closed-loop highways, reserved exclusively for red ball traffic. Planners recognized that most French roads were too narrow for heavy two-way military traffic, so they imposed one-way circulation. One road carried trucks toward the front, another carried them back. Entry points were controlled, civilian traffic was excluded, and military police attempted to enforce order. Convoys followed strict rules: limited speed, fixed spacing, minimal stops, and mandatory movement, both day and night. Headlights were dimmed, blackout lights used, and drivers pushed forward regardless of exhaustion. The scale of the operation was staggering. Within days, thousands of trucks were assigned to the Red Ball Express. Entire truck companies were redirected, and when that was not enough, volunteers were pulled from other units, many with little or no driving experience. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles operated simultaneously, hauling fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. On record days, convoys delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies in 24 hours. Fuel, known as petroleum, oil, and lubricants, dominated cargo loads. Because, without gasoline, the advance stopped instantly. Behind the statistics was a human system operating under extreme pressure. Approximately 3/4 of the soldiers assigned to the Red Ball Express were African American, reflecting the segregation of the U.S. Army and the assignment of black troops to service units. These drivers worked brutal schedules, often driving for hours beyond authorized limits. Fatigue caused accidents, breakdowns, and deaths. Vehicles were repaired with improvised parts, engines ran without maintenance, and rules were bent daily to keep trucks moving. As one observer noted, the trucks broke down, but they did not break. Danger was constant. German aircraft occasionally strafed convoys, artillery fire threatened forward routes, and mines littered damaged roads. Weather made conditions worse. Rain turned dirt roads into mud, flooded rivers washed out bridges, and mechanical failures multiplied. Maintenance units could not keep pace with the tempo, forcing drivers to abandon disabled vehicles along the roadside. Discipline suffered as exhaustion mounted. Supplies disappeared into black markets, speed limits were ignored, and convoy spacing collapsed. Yet, despite these failures, the system continued to function because stopping was not an option. The Red Ball Express directly shaped battlefield outcomes. Every gallon of fuel delivered meant tanks could keep moving. Every crate of ammunition meant attacks could continue without pause. Commanders understood the connection clearly. When supplies arrived, advances resumed. When deliveries slowed, units stalled. The Express allowed Allied forces to reach Paris, support its liberation, and push eastward toward the German border. Though it never met all planned targets, it delivered far more than any alternative system available at the time. Without it, momentum would have been lost. Comparisons between planning and reality reveal the system's importance. Pre-invasion estimates assumed slower advances and functional railways. In reality, armies advanced far faster than expected, and rail transport remained unusable for months. The Red Ball Express exceeded its initial goals, precisely because planners extended it beyond its original scope. What was meant to be temporary became continuous. Routes stretched over 1,000 kilometers round trip, pushing drivers and vehicles beyond designed limits. This gap between expectation and delivery highlighted the limits of pre-war planning and the necessity of adaptation. Visually, the Red Ball Express resembled a moving assembly line. Trucks flowed forward like conveyor belts, unloading at depots, turning around and returning without pause. At night, blackout lights stretched to the horizon, creating endless chains of motion. The system lacked elegance, but it possessed relentless energy. It transformed roads into arteries and trucks into lifeblood. This imagery was not metaphorical exaggeration. Allied commanders explicitly described logistics as the circulation system of the army, and the Red Ball Express became its heart. By sustaining the advance through improvisation rather than perfection, the Red Ball Express redefined what logistics could achieve under pressure. It demonstrated that speed could compensate for inefficiency, that human endurance could temporarily replace infrastructure, and that victory depended as much on drivers as on infantry. Though deeply flawed, the system proved decisive in the most critical phase of the campaign. The Allied advance survived not because logistics were well planned, but because they were brutally adapted to reality, mile by mile, ton by ton, truck by truck. By mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express finally came to an end. Not because it had failed, but because the situation had changed. Rail lines were gradually repaired. Ports began to function, and more structured systems like the XYZ Express replaced emergency measures. What had started as a short-term improvisation became a bridge between chaos and stability, allowing Allied forces to continue fighting deep into France without losing momentum at the most critical moment of the campaign. The Red Ball did not deliver perfection. It delivered time. The lessons were unmistakable. Logistics could no longer be treated as a background activity planned once and forgotten. The Red Ball Express proved that sustainment was an active, adaptive battlefield function, shaped by enemy action, infrastructure damage, and operational tempo, improvisation redundancies, and the often invisible enablers, such as drivers, mechanics, engineers, and traffic controllers, determined success as surely as firepower. Modern armies would later formalize these lessons, but in 1944 they were learned through exhaustion, risk, and constant motion. Equally important was the human legacy. The Red Bull Express relied overwhelmingly on African-American soldiers who served in segregated units and received little recognition at the time. Their contribution was essential, yet their story remained largely absent from popular narratives of World War II for decades. Only later did historians and veterans emphasize that without these drivers, mechanics, and loaders, tanks would have stood idle and victories would have stalled. Recognition came late, but the historical record is now clear. In the end, the Red Ball Express reinforces a simple truth about warfare. Battles create headlines, but logistics decide outcomes. Armies advance only as fast as their supplies allow. In 1944, the Allied breakthrough across France was not sustained by strategy alone, but by thousands of trucks turning roads into lifelines. The system was inefficient, dangerous, and deeply flawed, yet it worked when nothing else could. The Allied advance stayed alive because someone kept the wheels turning, and that, more than any single battle, shaped the road to victory in Europe.